Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on some rare improvised vehicles and homemade tanks from the Anglo-Iraqi War of 1941. The Anglo-Iraqi War was a rare battlefront in the Second World War between the British Empire and the Kingdom of Iraq in May 1941, from May the 2nd, 1941 until May 31st, 1941. But first, let's go over some of the history of Iraq up until this point. Now, between January and April 1941, Iraq had been in the middle of a political crisis between the royalist or the pro-British forces versus the Arab nationalists within the Iraqi government. Now, the Arab nationalists were led by a man named Rashid Ali al-Gaylani, who was an Arab nationalist of Iraqi origin, and he wished to replace the current pro-British government with a pro-Axis government. Now, he was actually prime minister from 1940 until February 1941, and in April 1941, he and his faction overthrew the Iraqi government in a coup d'etat, and making himself the new prime minister or leader of Iraq. And eventually, Rashid Ali Gaylani switched Iraq's allegiance from the UK into the Axis powers. Both Germany and Italy agreed with this and actually tried to supply Iraq with some weapons, and actually did for that 1 month period of time. But on the 2nd of May 1941, the British forces invaded Iraq after Iraqi forces had tried to take over the British air base of Hybenia in the Basra region in southern Iraq. When the war broke out on the 2nd of May 1941, the Iraqi army actually had a decent number of fighters. The Iraqi army had about 30,000 fighters under the leadership of Rashid Ali al-Gaylani versus the British army, which had 1 infantry division and 2 brigades, plus 100 aircraft and some vessels from the Royal Navy. But this video is going to be on some of the rare infantry vehicles used by the Iraqis and British forces during this conflict. And the first vehicle on the list is the Iraqi Crossley armored car. Now, the Crossley armored car was a series of armored cars that originated in the UK. The Crossley series of armored cars originally entered service in 1917, 1918 during the First World War, and from 1918 on forward, the Crossley armored car series were upgraded and redesigned dozens of times between 1918 and 1940. Now, the Iraqi Crossley armored car is a rare variant of the Crossley armored car, using different equipment. Differences between the Iraqi and British Crossley armored cars mostly rely in the chassis and the turret. Now, these Iraqi Crossley armored cars were actually fitted with one 7.7mm Vickers machine gun, 1 or 2 7.7mm Vickers machine gun, 1 in the chassis and 1 in the revolving turret. But they could also be fitted with one 37mm Vickers gun, Vickers anti-tank gun, or one 40mm 2-pounder anti-tank gun if needed. These vehicles had an armor thickness of between 6 and 8 millimeters and had a speed of 70 kilometers per hour or 45 miles per hour, and a crew of between 3 and 5. Now, the Iraqi army had around 20 of these vehicles, 20 to 30 of these Crossley armored cars in service. Many of these were actually constructed originally by the British, but were modified by the Iraqis between the years 1940 and 1941. And so these are some of the rare vehicles. Now, when the British invaded Iraq in May 1941, many of these vehicles were either captured intact or were destroyed in combat, and the remaining captured vehicles were used by British occupation forces until the British eventually left Iraq after the Second World War. And what happened to these Iraqi Crossley armored cars is pretty much unknown, as there's no real record of them after World War II, making these some of the rarest armored cars to be used in the Second World War, and one of the rare vehicles to be used by the Iraqi army during the Second World War. The next armored car on the list is the Iraqi Fiat Crossley, and these were armored trucks that were constructed between 1940 and 1941. Now, these vehicles were actually based on modification of the Crossley armored car, but this time using weapons and armaments that were supplied by the Italians. Now, some of these vehicles used a mixture of British and Italian weapons and armor, and these vehicles were armed with either one 7.7mm Vickers machine gun or one 37mm Vickers gun, and some were also armed with 47mm Cannondale 47/model 1932 anti-tank guns, and these were Italian anti-tank guns that were used originally by the Italian Army. These anti-tank guns were also fitted to some of the Italian tank destroyers later on during the Second World War. These vehicles could also be mounted with the 47mm Italian anti-tank gun. Their armor thickness was the same as the previous Crossley armored car series, between 6 and 8 millimeters. Their speed was 70 kilometers per hour or 45 miles per hour, and they had a crew of between 3 and 5 also. These vehicles were pretty limited. Only about 10 or 15 of these Iraqi Fiat Crossley armored cars were actually used by the Iraqi army during the Second World War, making them one of the rare armored car series to be used in the Second World War. Another class of rare weapons used by the Iraqi forces comes in the form of the Iraqi River Navy. Now, Iraq actually had a very small naval force that was originally constructed in 1937, and the main vessels used in this naval force were the Abd al-Rahman class of riverine gunboats that were constructed originally in 1937. Now, the Abd al-Rahman class consisted of 4 gunboats, and these vessels had a displacement of 67 tons. Their main armaments were one 94mm 12 caliber mountain guns. These were produced in the UK. Their secondary armament were 2 81mm Stokes mortar launchers, and they were also fitted with 2 7.7mm Vickers machine guns. Their armor thickness was up to 12 millimeters over vital areas, and they had a speed of 12 knots or 22.2 kilometers per hour or 13.8 miles per hour, and they had a crew of between 15 and 20. And these Abd al-Rahman class gunboats were actually constructed by the British Thornycroft Company between 1936 and 1937, and the class consisted of the gunboats Abd al-Rahman or gunboat number 1, the gunboat al-Ghazi, the gunboat Det al-Daria, and the gunboat al-Jannah or al-Jannah. And these gunboats actually served for a long time, but during the Anglo-Iraqi War, they were actually captured by the British fleet after it entered the Euphrates and Tigris rivers where these vessels were stationed. Now, after the Anglo-Iraqi War, these vessels actually served for a long time. These vessels served from 1945 all the way up until 1981, mostly as barrack ships or training vessels for the post-World War II era Iraqi Navy. Finally, in 1981, these vessels were sold for scrap when the Saddam Hussein government took over Iraq, during the same time period as the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted until 1988. So the Abd al-Rahman class actually served for roughly 40 years or over 40 years, making it one of the longest serving warship classes in the Iraqi Navy. And that brings us to the most interesting armored fighting vehicle on the list, and these are actually 2 completely separate vehicles that were constructed at the same time, and these were actually used by the British forces, and these were the tanks that were nicknamed Walrus and Tyleen. And Walrus and Tyleen were 2 improvised infantry support tanks that were constructed in 1941, just before the invasion of Iraq. Now, the British had actually been preparing for the invasion of Iraq once Rashid Ali al-Gaylani took over in April 1941. So they had about 30 days to prepare, and during that 30 days, one of the British Army groups actually constructed some improvised tanks, and these were 2 vehicles that were nicknamed Walrus in Thailand, and they had a main armament of one or two 7.7 millimeter Vickers or Lewis machine guns. They could also be fitted with one 37 millimeter Vickers gun, or one 2-pounder anti-tank gun, or one 40 millimeter 2-pounder anti-tank gun. The second tank, Thailand, could be fitted with a 40 millimeter anti-tank gun if needed. The first tank, the armor thickness of these vehicles were between 6 and 10 millimeters. They had a speed of around 13 miles per hour or 21 kilometers per hour, and a crew of between 2 and 4. These tanks were actually constructed using British Dragoon Caterpillar tractors, and they were actually modeled after the Vickers medium tank Mark I and II, and these were two classes of British medium tanks that were designed in the 1920s. So these vehicles were actually designed to mimic those vehicles. The only differences between these two vehicles is the turret. The improvised tank Walrus has the turret of a British Rolls-Royce armored car, while the Thailand actually has a more conventional turret that can be fitted with a 37 or 40 millimeter anti-tank gun. These two improvised tanks were used by a mixed unit of British Indian, and Syrian and Iraqi Assyrian troops that were under orders from the British Army, and they were used during the invasion of Iraq in 1941. Now, what happened to these tanks after 1941 is a mystery, as I cannot find any more information on the Walrus in Thailand, but it seems they might have been decommissioned around 1942 and 1943 after the fall of the German army in North Africa during Operation Torch. So I guess these tanks were pretty much useless after 1941. By 1942, the British were using more advanced tanks, so I'm pretty sure the British Army occupying Iraq would have received some of those newer tanks, and so these improvised tanks were pretty much useless. And that basically ends this video. These were some of the rare improvised vehicles or rare modifications of existing vehicles that were used by both the British and Iraqi forces during the Anglo-Iraqi War of 1941. So which one is your favorite? If you ask me, I like the two British improvised tanks and the Iraqi gunboats of the al-Rahman class as my two favorites on this list. So what do you think? Please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.